Um, wow, what an evening so far. And now we get to transcend everything and move to brand new realms. And just so people know, Louise and I met like 45, 50 years ago when I was new to poetry in the city, and we had friends in common who were also poets, and we did some poetry events way back then. I remember we did a workshop in the apartment that you had over on, was Stanton, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Stanley. Yes.
And and to this day I remember that, and some of the things that you we did there, or you directed us to do, I still find very handy. So the little introduction that I have here, introducing Louise to all of you, she's a native New Yorker who moved to the Bay Area in 1976. Her most recent book is Poised for Retirement, Moving from Anxiety to Zen. Her previous book, Burned, a memoir from 2010 and republished in 2016, was an Oprah Great Read and won the Wisconsin Library Association Award. She also has two written books of poetry, one with funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, and she co-authored How to Bury a Goldfish, 113 Rituals for Everyday Life with Virginia Lang. She retired from teaching for 27 years at City College of San Francisco and now teaches at Ollie, UC Berkeley, and at the Writers Grotto, where she has been a member for 7 years. She also works with students on developing their memoirs. She's written articles for OZY, the San Francisco Chronicle, Wear Your Voice, and the Arizona Daily. And she's currently working on her fifth book. Is that still correct?
Actually, it's out. Uh,
Ah!
Narrow Escapes. Yes, that's what I'll be reading from. That's a book I'm most excited about. It's always your new baby, I guess. Okay. Well, first I wanted to thank Dan for inviting me. And actually, my first poetry book was published when he got a grant through the National Endowment for the Arts. So he was one of the people who furthered my writing career. And I feel like poetry is really my first home. I loved hearing all your work. Thank you to my students for being here. Thank you to all of you for being here. And it's wonderful to hear your words. So I'm just going to do a very quick talk about my book, which is really a journey. It's an actual adventure through France, Morocco, New York City, California, where I'm trying to find my path in life, trying to figure out. I have a little bit of a sorry, my voice gets a little weird, but figure out relationships. And it's also a journey of leaving home. And part of leaving home was coming out to California and dealing with an early trauma. Okay, I'm going to read from a few different sections, and I'm going to start right from the beginning, which has some backstory. Okay, chapter 1. I came close to death in Marrakesh. My traveling companion, Jacqueline, went out shopping while I lay on my bunk, weak and sick, hallucinating red and yellow colors that danced and fluttered across the pea green walls at the youth hostel. Had I known this would happen, I might never have gone on this journey when school ended. But hindsight is 2020. I was young. It was 1969. A global youth peace movement swept the world. Hundreds of thousands of mostly middle-class kids, thumbs out on the endless highways of the world, entering and leaving countries they knew little about. All people are good, I wanted to believe, like my heroine, Anne Frank, even as bombs dropped fire on villages in Vietnam. And this is the beginning. Be careful. Don't be silly. Keep your traveler's checks and passport in your money belt, my mother said to me on the deck of the student ship, the Aurelia, before I left for France on my junior year abroad. My mother was a practical, no-nonsense woman who always had her ducks in a row. That July morning, only a few days before the moon landing in 1969, she wore a pressed khaki skirt, white silk shirt, and navy blue blazer. The daughter of a Presbyterian minister who adopted her at 9 after her biological father ran off, and a religious mother, she had pulled herself up with a master's degree in nursing education from Columbia University, unusual for a woman of her time. In 1942, she married my father, a Jewish doctor with Ivy League credentials. We had a beautiful home in Greenwich Village. My mother's impeccable dockside attire was in sharp contrast to my peasant blouse and ragged jeans, too tight for my thighs. I had gained 20 pounds drinking beer in the Yakima Valley, Washington, where I worked that summer with the American Friends, a Quaker organization helping in a migrant community. I almost dropped out of school and stayed in Washington, pulled like so many others towards doing community work. Plus, I had a love affair with Mateo, a lawyer and spokesperson for the migrant community. I left the Yakima Valley with a heaviness in my heart, desperately alone, traveling through 3 time zones, Seattle to New York City. I found real work here. I'm dropping out of college, I wrote to my parents 2 weeks earlier, but I tore up the letter. It was scary to drop out of college, to defy my accomplished parents. I got stoned with some legal aid workers in Seattle who drove me to the airport late. I missed my flight, but I dutifully boarded the next flight and slept through the landing and takeoff in Chicago, groggy with leaving a place I loved and scared to go on the next journey. 5 days later, I stood on the deck of a huge ship that left for France. On the deck, my mother handed me a big floppy doll with brown braids and a pink flowered pinafore. From that New England catalog, she said, looking at me and hoping I would accept her gift, even though I was too old for a doll. I turned away for a minute, aware of her scars and the smell of heavy cosmetics. Blobs of flesh, like silly putty, covered her face below her eyes and down her neck. You could see a thin red line where flesh from her stomach was sewn on, and a crisscross line like a jagged stitch on her neck flesh. Her eyebrows were drawn on with pencils, and her right eye was slightly bigger than the other. Her perfect outfits couldn't hide her reconstructed face. An explosion in the dank cellar of a summer rental in Wellfleet, Massachusetts. I was 4 years old. My mother's hands and face were blackened with burns. No hot water to wash my face, my mother said to my dad when they got home. He held the flashlight as they climbed down the rickety ladder to the musty cellar to light the pilot light on the hot water tank. Gas with no smell had escaped. My mother lit the match. Blue flames ravaged her face and hands. My father, too. My mother's face would be unrecognizable. They narrowly escaped the fire. Earlier that evening, they had passed the gas men on the road and waved at them, 2 ordinary cars passing at twilight. My last memory before she lost her face, my mother kissing me goodbye, a lavender shawl swept over her shoulders, the scent of rose perfume, her shining eyes. A few minutes later, our fate was sealed. Our babysitter, Della, let the men in to change the propane tank, a faulty valve, 9 months of separation, a perfect storm of grief. Now on the broad deck of the enormous student ship, my mother's smell was thick from cosmetics, covered over by Chanel perfume. I stared back at the strangers on deck who looked at her too long. My mother is not a freak, I wanted to shout to the world. Thanks, Mommy. Even though I was 19, I still called her Mommy, as if I could be 4 years old forever, before the fire, to always stay a happy little girl. I clutched the doll to me, rubbing my face over the thick brown braids. My mother stayed until the last minute. No hugs, just a quick peck on the cheek. Her white patent leather purse slung over her shoulder, she walked briskly back onto the streets of Manhattan, away from the deep groaning sounds of the ship about to leave port. I wanted to run after her, to cling to her skirts and shout, "Mommy, don't go." I used to press my face against the window pane of our second floor apartment, watching for her red coat coming back to me after one of her 37 operations. I tried to have faith that she'd always return, but I wasn't so sure. Now I was the one leaving. I took the steep steps down to my bunk, so low in the ship I didn't even have a porthole. 3 days later, a morning newspaper slid under my door. Men had landed on the moon and planted an American flag on that luminescent sphere. In small print, below all the fanfare about the moon landing, I saw a little boy had drowned in a stream full of reeds. Tears flooded my eyes. I felt so sad for him and his family to die in the reeds when America was celebrating the moon landing. Deep down, I lived in this chiaroscuro world, great joy shading to great grief. So that's just the opening, the beginning. And then this next portion is traveling in Morocco. And I think we were so naive in a way. I hitchhiked in Morocco, and in the end, everything did end up being fine. But I knew so little about the culture, and I actually ate salad at the souk, and I was told never to eat salad there. So there was a rebellion. So I'm very sick at this point. So this is part of the title, Narrow Escapes. The next morning, I glared at the walls from my top dormitory bunk alone, hallucinating bright colors, mainly oranges and reds, colors that looked like sunrises. The Marrakesh Express still played in my brain, but the needle was stuck on the record player. Don't you know we're riding? Don't you know we're riding? My fantasies of travel and new places were erased. Marrakesh. I had finally made it to Marrakesh. I vaguely remember trying to drink water, but everything went through me. I was sick, seriously sick. Everyone in the hostel was gone, Jacqueline too. I didn't think of going to the European side of town, to a European doctor. Make do with what money you have. Plus, I was not a rich American. I was a student and one of the real people. That's what I still believed, even as I got sicker and sicker. The next afternoon, though, I asked Jacqueline to take me to a doctor near the hostel. Someone told us about this clinic. We walked through the brutal heat for what felt like forever. I leaned on her, weak and dehydrated, my throat dry and parched. Jacqueline looked worried and also pissed off. This was not the vacation she wanted. My legs buckled as we walked up a huge flight of stairs to the waiting room. I wanted to lie down and sleep forever in one of the shadowy places under the wooden slatted ceilings, terrified that if I didn't get medicine soon, I could collapse. I had one bottle of water, but it was almost gone, just a few warm sips. I wanted Jacqueline to get more water, but I didn't want her to leave me. She was quiet, her lips pursed as if she were angry. When we went through the door to the waiting room, around 40 people, many who looked extremely sick, from the very old to the very young, sat in chairs and waited. The room smelled of desperation and sweat. We luckily found 2 seats, and I collapsed into one. A tiny sick boy lay in his mother's arms next to me. I immediately had to go to the bathroom that was mercifully empty. I came back and sat in the stiff wooden chairs, I clutched my stomach as if that would stop the churning. I waited. I needed medicine. I wanted my daddy. Jacqueline read a book next to me. An old school clock ticked loudly. What was time? My mother taught me, to tell time, and how proud I was when I finally learned, just like my sister. I loved the big clock on the wall in my room as a child, round as a moon. This clock ticked too loudly. Sounds hurt my ears. Sorry, I just have to. One small fan blew some hot air across the room. Some adults even had tears dripping down their creased faces. Sick children with glazed eyes tried to sleep in their parents' arms. I began to feel my eyes too were glazing. Here you go, my dad would say, and hand me a prescription. Or better yet, if I were this sick, he would bring the medicine to me, or my mother would bring it to me. It would work in 6 hours or so. I would watch Lassie on TV in my parents' bed. In one episode, Timmy and Lassie leapt through small brush fires that threatened to devour the forest. Run, 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 escape the fire, I whispered. Don't get burned. Years later, I realized that I was always running away from fire. Fire and love got meshed together. My mother would call to make sure my temperature was down. I was an unlucky girl because of the accident, but I was also a lucky girl. But now I wasn't lucky. I had to wait so long. What was luck? What made you lucky? My mother's mother, my grandmother, Fanny, always wanted to bless me. She always wore a big cross around her neck and prayed silently before eating. Grandpa and I pray for you every night, she said. But Grandpa had died. Could he still bless me and pray for me from heaven, call me his little buttercup? I had also done something stupid. I was told not to eat salad in Morocco. I didn't want to be like my parents, to follow an itinerary, to follow all the rules. In the world of mules, there are no rules. I love that Ogden Nash poem, but not following rules could be deadly. I had been distracted, like skiing off trail and getting lost in a snowstorm. Jacqueline sat beside me on the stiff wooden chair. The suffocating heat gripped my body. My stomach did flip-flops. I ran to the bathroom, praying that I wouldn't have to wait in line, but there were 3 people in front of me, one coughing so hard it sounded like her lungs would rupture. I came back and sat down. I tried to sleep, resting my head on the back of the wooden chair and then in my palms. Nothing felt comfortable. Plus, what if the doctor called my name and I missed my turn? I was number 45. I counted all the people who went in front of me. When I went to the restroom again, I hoped Jacqueline would listen carefully for Nayer. It might be mispronounced. Would she hear it? Listen so hard? So many sick people, an avalanche of sick people. I always had professional courtesy growing up. If I needed to see a doctor, tastefully colored walls, I'd look through magazines, maybe the New Yorker or Vogue, and the doctor would come out with a friendly smile. How nice to see you, Louise, he would say. How are your parents? I had no professional courtesy here and was swept into the sad reality of poverty and not enough medical care. One doctor and a room overflowing with terribly sick people. I wondered for a quick, terrifying second if I could die waiting. My dad had helped start one of the first HMOs in America. He sometimes took paintings or food instead of money. His parents taught him to take care of the poor, not just himself, to give back. So many poor people in this waiting room and just one doctor. Nayer, Nayer, the doctor called out. My legs and hands quivered as I lifted myself out of the chair and walked with great hope into the doctor's office. I sat down in a chair. He looked haggard. His white coat hung loosely over a thin frame. He wore spectacles and looked down at me. I can't treat you, he said in English. Tears flooded my eyes. Why not? I need medicine. I'm very sick. Now tears gushed down my face. I can't treat you, he said again, and then whisked me out of his office, coming close to pulling me up from the chair and physically throwing me out of the room. Look at all these people I need to see, my people. Look at all these people. Go away. I could hardly talk as Jacqueline and I descended the stairs. I was a middle-class girl from America. Why wasn't I at the European side of town? So many poor Moroccans sat in that waiting room, many with sick children on their laps. And then a rich American comes in and takes one of their spots. I wanted to think of myself as a poor student, but I wasn't. Now too much time had elapsed to think, ruminate, cogitate, deliberate. You had to be deliberate to think, and I was losing that ability. Thoughts left my head and turned into blue, red, and yellow balloons that vanished into the sky. My parents could always wire me money, but I couldn't make that happen. I was descending into hell when the hot air of the street hit me. People went by walking too fast. I imagine what I wanted Jacqueline to do. If she had been a real best friend like Ken, she'd say, I'll take care of you. Just relax. Who cares about the money? You're going to get better. She'd whisk me into a cab, rush me somewhere, take charge, red alert, flashing buttons, screeching sirens, ambulances. In Malaga, at the very beginning of our trip, when we jumped out of a crazy driver's car, I got ice for her, making sure she was okay. I needed a buddy, a real buddy. Wretched thoughts drifted in and out of my consciousness. I was back in the dormitory. Jacqueline walked back with me, but now she was gone. I think she went shopping. I managed to climb to the top bunk again, but my legs shook on each rung of the ladder. I wondered if my hands would hold me. I collapsed onto the thin mattress, smelling of my sickly, fetid, feverish sweat. A few words spun around and around, but it was a grinding sound I was hearing. My mind felt separated, like puzzle pieces that don't fit, a round piece shoved into a square hole, all the edges ragged, like a rip in my stocking. Put nail polish on the rip. I could hear my mother's voice, bossy, comforting. Don't throw them out. We've become too much of a throwaway society. I reached for my water bottle, thin, clear water, a bottle like a baby, but no one held me. People came and went. Then the room was empty. Even moving my arms was difficult. I saw my daddy standing in the doorway of my bedroom where I grew up, then heard him recite Shakespeare. Good night, sweet princess, like let flights of angels sing thee to thy rest. But angels signified a darkness I didn't want to go through. I'm just 20, I thought to myself, just 2 decades, 2 sets of 10, 4 sets of fingers on my hand. Then I was Tinker Bell, the tiny fairy from Peter Pan who held a mirror near her lit by a lamp. She was always surrounded by light. In Peter Pan, when Tinker Bell's light was dying, all who loved her clapped for her, and her light returned like an epiphany. At first it flickered, then died. But then suddenly, like a heart that starts beating, the light surrounded her and she could soar. My sister and I watched Peter Pan on TV and would clap for Tinker Bell. How could such a sweet being die? Why did anyone die? I shivered. My breaths were thready and shallow. Had I been bad? I ate salad at the souk. I shouldn't have. That was bad. Why did my parents return with burns all over their bodies? Did I whine the day they were burned, not take a nap, refuse to tie my shoes, one little stringy shoelace over the next? My eyes drowned with tears as shadows raged across the wall. My sister Annie and I played flashlight tag at night when we couldn't sleep. But these shadows came from the dark and not from the light, and my mouth tasted metallic. I couldn't even spit. I couldn't say the words, help me. The dorm had emptied of people, only scattered knapsacks covering the 5 other bunk beds. I conjured up all the people who loved me, even my dead grandparents I'd never met, my Jewish grandparents on my dad's side, who came from Vilnius and died before I was born. Lena, David, Uncle Philip, who died when he was 22, and then the ones I knew in this life, Reverend Joseph and Fanny Daubert, my mother's parents, my mother's father, who called me his little buttercup, Nancy, my next door neighbor, Mom, Dad, Annie. Clap louder, I whispered, clap louder. And then I heard the door open. A tall woman entered, long red hair and blue eyes, like my Aunt Rusty, who cared for me when my parents were burned. Perhaps she rode here on wisps of Aunt Rusty's red hair. She put her things on her bed and then saw me. I lifted myself up for a moment and stared at her warm blue eyes. She plopped her stuff on a free bed, then came over to me. You're very sick. This is serious. I'm a nurse. Is it dysentery? She had an English accent. Yes, I said, my lips parched, slightly bloody, and so cracked that it hurt to talk. She rummaged in her purse and found charcoal tablets. These will stop the diarrhea, but you need fluids. Bowls of chicken soup and bottled water emerged from out of nowhere. For the first time in 3 nights, I didn't get up in the dark, my legs shaking each time, trying so hard to steady myself. I rested all through the next day, the colors that had danced across the wall now turning white again. I took the charcoal tablets, slept for hours, and drank fluids, little by little, getting my strength returned. Little by little, my strength returned. My angel, my nurse, my miracle.
Thank you. No, unmute, ladies and gentlemen. Let her know.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all for listening. I'm sure we've all had stories like that. So
So beautiful.
thank you. Thank you.
Lovely. I'm thinking of going to Morocco now.
Well, there's some good parts of it that I wrote about. I wouldn't go how I went, hitchhiking.
No, I don't think so.
Louise, I think I was on the Aurelia, maybe in the same time, unless it went back and forth several
Oh
times.
God, yeah. Hi, Alice. Yeah, yeah. Maybe you were. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Maybe we saw each other. Big studentship.